You are listening to
Radio Unheard,
a podcast for cultural professionals where we explore the ethical dilemmas around the intersection of art and politics. I'm your host, Asia Tsisar, and in this season, we're going to drown together in the question of solidarity. This is part 2 of the episode Displacement in Compartments of Solidarity. My guest is Zeynep Şahin Mencütek. In the first part of this episode, thanks to sharp observations by Ukrainian social anthropologist Ruslana Koziienko, we reviewed how the current structures of protection system tend to compartmentalize people with the experience of displacement, and how those legal devices and narratives around prevent people from solidarizing with each other. In the second part, Dr. Zeynep Şahin Mencütek helps us to place this problem in a broader context and examine the general trends of the erosion of protection for displaced people worldwide, and how the rise of right-wing powers exploits the subject of migration, not only in the EU, but globally.
My name is Zeynep Şahin Mencütek. I have a PhD in politics and international relations. I'm a senior researcher and a doctor here in Germany. My institution is Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies. Currently, I am coordinating a Horizon Europe project about the return migration, and I have been working on the migration governance, refugee studies, diaspora, and similar topics, mainly from the sociological and the political perspective.
Can you tell us the history of temporary protection system, how it was developed and what was the main reasons why it was developed?
Yeah, temporary protection has been in implementation for a while in practice and de facto, but it is legal codification is mainly done with the EU directive in 2001. But actually it was used before in several formats, both for the Vietnamese refugees in South Asia, for example, in the US context, and also it used during the Yugoslav war to protect Bosnians in Europe in early 1990s, Kosovars in the late 1990s, and also several other countries in different formats, specifically those countries who are not a signatory of the Refugee Convention. When we look at the content of the temporary protection, it is an emergency measure to provide an immediate protection, and specifically in the events of the mass influx towards the people who are unable to return. The protection status gives this necessary protection, and it is also protecting asylum system, which will be under pressure if tried to proceed all of these applications. First of all, it is responding to practical needs of the countries who encounter with the mass influx, which is not a rare case. Often the refugee movements are happening in a very short time period and also in very massive numbers, in which the countries cannot really respond in an orderly manner. The temporary protection is helping to this humanitarian aspect. The second thing is more about legal part, the protection gaps, and the 1951 convention does not fully address the protection needs of all the people, because it has a very specific measures, but at the same time, in this case, there are still the risk that people will be sent to the countries which they will face to the risk of persecution, torture, or human rights violations. These protection gaps can be addressed by the temporary protection. And the last thing is the state responsibilities. The states are responsible to protect, even though they are not the part of the Refugee Convention, and they have this protection responsibility due to their signature to the other international conventions like the Convention Against the Torture or Human Rights Convention. The temporary protection also allow the states to fulfill these responsibilities.
Do I understand correctly that it was developed in the EU and then adopted in countries like Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and so on? Or I'm mistaking something?
I think I should correct that I didn't mean that these countries adopted to the EU directive. These countries were already using de facto protection mechanisms, although they don't call this a temporary protection. But when you look at their asylum system, you are going to see that they are adopting a temporary protection very similar to what the EU is doing. These countries are not EU member states and they may not approve the directive, but countries like Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, India, and many South Asian countries, we see that it is a de facto in usage. I mean that in practice, practice, they use such things, but they don't call it temporary protection directive. So let me add that many countries are not the signatory of the convention. For instance, in the Middle East region, only Iran, Israel, Egypt, and Yemen are the party of the convention. While many other states like Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan, also the most states like Pakistan, Iran, who have a large number of the refugees or mass influxes, they are not the part of the refugee convention, but they have their own asylum mechanisms and the protection mechanisms, which includes to the temporary protection.
Do you have an answer why in 2015 the temporary protection directive wasn't activated?
Yeah, it is a difficult question because as we are not in these rooms that the EU decided about what directives, which type of policies they will put into practice. But there are some analyses which we can recall that. First of all, I agree with many scholars that the EU should have adapted the protection directive in responding to the 2015 refugee crisis. It may give a flexibility to the EU and its member states, and it can also ease the life of the people who are displaced or who are in mobility. But instead of that, although the temporary protection directive is in EU's toolbox, EU preferred to have these 10 points action plan in the 2015 and then the European agenda on the migration in the same year to create solidarity between the EU countries to respond to the 2015. But what could be the reasons? And we can just hypothesize that. But the first can be tell that EU is always avoiding to create this pull factor. And it was a belief that if the temporary protection is activated, it may encourage many migrants in the neighboring countries to migrate to the EU. Because there will be a legal basis, there will be, the access to rights, there will be access to, the protection. And main hypothesis can be that you avoided this creating a pull factor. And also, we should underline that in the 2050s, mass influence has a very mixed composition. It is not like an Ukrainian crisis that the one aggressor invaded the country and then displacement happened. In the 2015, it was the mixed. Yes, there are people who needs an immediate protection and they deserve a refugee status, like Syrians and Afghans or Ethiopians. But also there were many people from other countries who joined these mass influx, and also they claimed an asylum as well. I mean, it doesn't underline the fact that yes, there were people there in the need of protection, but at the same time this mixed composition was a question mark. Plus many of these people who needs a protection at that time, they were already provided some kind of protection in the neighboring countries of the conflict. Like many Syrians were already in Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon or Afghans in Iran, and they have access to the protection, not a fully, but some kind of protection which differing them to the immediate need of protection. And lastly, may I also underline that I'm a scholar of political science, and there were different stakes or perspectives about the Ukrainian crisis. It was very close to Europe, and there was this risk the war or the threat can spread to the other countries, and the EU countries feel more responsibility towards Ukraine in general, and also the Ukrainian refugees to immediately respond. But assuming that this 2015 crisis taught something to the EU about how to respond to such mass influxes, because in the 2015 there is such a huge problem about the responsibility and burden sharing between the EU countries. This redistribution of the migrants didn't work out. Some countries have a huge burden, like Germany had almost 1 million refugees from that time, while the other countries did not really shoulder, let's say, burden or responsibility. But this made the EU think that we should fairly distribute the responsibility, which the temporary protection at least give this right that people can move whatever they want and then ask the status in this country. And I think there's also this learning component, maybe small, maybe less important than the geopolitics, less important than the mixed flows. But still, there is this component here. But at the end of the day, I believe this different responses in both cases raised serious questions about EU and this humanitarian side. Also, don't forget that when the Ukrainian crisis happened, the Taliban took over Afghanistan. People also were fleeing, but the response to the Afghan refugees and the Ukrainian refugees, both in EU and also beyond EU, I mean also Canada and the US, who provided protection to the Ukrainians, they didn't show the same flexibility to the Afghans. And these raised questions about, okay, who deserves protection, whether race or the religion plays a role, and differentiated humanitarianism. These all raise questions about, these different treatments within even the same period with Afghans and Ukrainians.
Can you briefly describe what happens to a person who comes to EU and apply for refugee status? What's their everyday life, where they live, what is permitted for them, what is not?
Yeah, as far as I know, I can give example from Germany because it is really depending on the country which rights they are giving and also which services they are giving. In Germany, for instance, if someone applies for the asylum, they are put into shelters. They are given a room, individual or shared room, and they can stay there and go out whatever they want. And they need to sign in every week. I don't know the frequency. They have pocket money for daily expenses. I guess it is something around 300 to 400, but I'm not sure because there was this discussion that instead of the money they will be given shopping carts, and probably this is done, I don't know. They don't have a right to work, and they also get some small language courses and social services within the camp. After their cases is accepted, which often takes minimal, I heard 1 year, but I heard 3 to 4 years as well, because even if it is rejected, asylum seekers has a right to appeal in the court, and then again another 1 year or 6 months, and then one appeal, and this goes like that. Also, asylum seekers cannot change their city. They have to stay in the camp and in the city they were first assigned. But in other countries, like in Netherlands or Sweden, they are not given that right of shelter. Also, this cash money, for instance, in Netherlands, there is no pocket money. After their status is accepted as a refugee, they have a right to change and rent an apartment until a certain price, which the municipality is covering. And meanwhile, this person has a right to go to the language course and diploma recognition, and have a right to the family unification. If it is a married man, if the kids are there, but right of family unification is changing according to the status. If it is a subsidiary protection, the full refugee status, the person has not right to get his family or her family. And for instance, now for Syrians, family unification is stopped. They cannot bring their families anymore. Also for Afghans, it is the same. And yeah, I think the language and integration course is 1 to 1.5 or 2 years. Meanwhile, they can look for a job, and if they have a contract, after all this, they are able to work. I guess also they are doing some training on the fields they want to work, which the state is covering.
When Temporary Protection Directive was activated for Ukrainians, there was a discussion about this status being a privilege. So I wanted to ask you, with all of your knowledge and critical approach, would you call temporary protection a privilege?
The temporary protection itself is not a privilege. It has advantages, to be honest. We should really acknowledge that it has many advantages because it has a very flexible eligibility criteria compared to the refugee status, and it has a broad personal scope, and also it has some harmonization with other protection standards like access to the education of the minors or access to the some kind of social welfare, but also the employment. It has some advantages. Whether it is a privilege or not, I'm not sure. But from the eyes of the other refugees, so for instance, in Germany, I know Syrians or Afghans are considering that Ukrainians are treated privilegedly in general system because of this employment issue, and also because they are faced with less bureaucratic hurdles compared to the other refugee groups. Also, there is not that much negative public discourse about Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. And I think it is one of the main reasons, because often the Afghan or the Syrian or other refugees are seen as a potential threat, and also the potential threat to cultural and the social norms in Europe. And this is very explicit in the social media, explicit in the public discourse or political discourse like the AFD or other far right. But there is not that much scope scapegoating of the Ukrainians. But I'm not sure that, let's say, one refugee is really aware of these different statuses. And then the last thing, at least in Germany, when the Ukrainian influx happened, specifically in the language courses, the Syrians and Afghans are said that right now there's a need for space for the Ukrainians. And they were sidelined from some of free services with the argument that the Ukrainians need these services more than them. The combination of all of these creating the sense of the privilege from the eyes of other refugees. But just last thing is that in other countries, for instance, in Turkey, there is these Syrians and Afghan refugees. But Afghans are thinking that Syrians are treated privilegedly. Actually, yes, because Syrians have a temporary protection, Afghans don't have a temporary protection, and also they have a very limited access to the normal asylum procedure. And because of that, Afghans don't have that much access to the health and hospitals. In Turkey, this is free for Syrians. And these differences make the Afghans to think that Syrians are privileged. And the same in, for instance, in Jordan between the Syrians versus Ethiopians refugee groups. And there is always this comparison and the consideration that one group is more privileged than the other. There is a fact inside because the countries select which services they will give to the which group. This is differentiated treatment or differentiated integration. For instance, the Syrians in Turkey, some of them are given this right to citizenship, while for Afghans it is just impossible.
Okay, I then will ask you to clear this thing for me. Temporary protection, as they say, means permanent insecurity.
Yeah.
While after a certain person granted the refugee status, basically this person is secure. But just for the record, do you know how many people apply for refugee status and how many are successful and how many of them got rejected?
I don't know, to be honest, because it's also differ from year to year, country to country, and also it doesn't mean that the person applied for the refugee status in 2015 and then they got it in 2016. There's also these backlogs in the systems that, the refugee status is taking years, like 3 to 4 years in Europe, and also in Turkey, for instance, it sometimes takes 10 years for Afghans to get a one status. This is why we always say it is a very precarious waiting, both for those who are in the temporary protection. For temporary protection, it's worse because there is this risk that it can be revoked, but also it depends on the nationality of the person. For instance, for a long time, for Syrians and Afghans, their asylum application is accepted, but right now in many countries, Syrians' asylum application was suspended because of the safe country. And from Afghanistan, often the women and the children's applications tend to be accepted, while the male applications are right away almost rejected. But from our experience with the Syrians, we know that those who came in 2015 and 16, some of them started to receive the citizenship. Mm-hmm. This is also the advantage of the refugee status compared to the temporary protection. Maybe numbers are not that much high, but after they accepted as an officially refugee and get a permanent residence, they need to wait, I guess, for 5 years or 7, because these years are also changing. And then they apply for the citizenship, and I know some colleagues, they already get the citizenship of Germany or other countries, while for those under temporary protection or subsidiary protection, it is impossible. I mean, they cannot apply because their duration is not accepted as a normal permanent residency. Maybe some things will change later on, but currently, this pathway to the naturalization or citizenship, or let's say the full-scale integration, is not possible for temporary protection.
In my conversation with Ruslana, we came to a very interesting observation that in current situation, Ukrainian displaced people, they are treated more as labor migrants than victims of the war. What is the relation between cheap labor migration and temporary protection status? Is it the same, for example, in Turkey or in other countries where this system was activated?
It is slightly different in other countries. In the nature of the temporary protection directive, access to the employment is not that much clear. But what the EU did for Ukrainian is that immediately mobilize this access to employment, right? It's also very unexpected. Even to the refugee status, even those Syrians or Afghans or other refugees in European countries, they are not able to work. They don't have any access to the employment for a long time. It's quite different for Ukrainians. They have immediate access to the labor market. This has some advantages because my interviews with refugees always showing that they want to work. I mean, if you put barrier on them to working, and also if you put a lot of barriers about language learning prior to the working, this is really make life very difficult for them, but also bring some positive aspects because they rely on the social assistance. This is also giving some minimal things. It has advantages and disadvantages, let's say. But when it comes to the non-EU countries, often refugees, even if there is a temporary protection status, they are not legally permitted to work. I mean, by law. In Turkey, after the temporary protection directive in 2014, I believe in 2016, Turkey introduced another legislation just for the Syrians and saying that Syrians can officially work. But it is not due to the temporary protection, but it was another legislation. However, we know that many refugees in these countries are informally working, and they are hugely contributing to the cheap labor market. Also, in some countries, they are the main driver of the sectors like textile, agriculture, right, construction, and these countries really benefit from this the labor market force. And it was also one of my notes that temporary protection status easing this informality in working, because it is bringing legal uncertainty, and also the refugees don't have that much right or saying, but at the same time they don't have any social benefits like retirement pensions, and also if there is any workplace incidents, which is not a rare, by the way, but they don't have such a protection because they are both informally working, but also their legal status is a little shaky. You are not a citizen, and you are not a permanent migrant, which you can make a claim. And I think, for instance, right now the Turkish example shows that these refugees' precarity is benefiting to the business and some sectors, unfortunately.
Who would you say is the main benefiter of both a system of refugee protection and temporary protection? Is it designed to help people, or it is more designed to secure the state?
From my perspective, it is more to secure the state interest. Why I tell that? Also, not only the EU context, I know it for the other contexts like, Lebanon, Turkey, Iran. The temporary protection gives the states room for maneuver because it is temporary. From its definition, it is temporary. And also, it depends on decision of the authority in that country. For instance, in the Turkish return directive, president can decide whether the protection should be revoked or not. Or in other countries, the parliament or ministries or whoever can decide whether it should be extended or it should be revoked. And also, that for stopping the protection, it is enough to deem one country as a safe country. And in some point, Afghanistan was also deemed as a safe country of origin. And the return operations happened from Germany and other EU countries to Afghanistan in 2015-16 because it is deemed as safe. But in a couple of years, it again collapsed. But also safe doesn't mean that the country is conducive to provide a protection to these people. But it is a political decision at the end of the day, continue the protection status or not. It's a political decision giving a maneuver to the country. Plus, the temporary protection is giving countries to select which groups they will give this status. There are cases, for instance, from the Middle East that some groups like Iraqis are not given a temporary protection, while at the same time Syrians were given. The country can select whom to give a protection. It's also a little similar in the EU case. The EU decided to give protection to the Ukrainians, for very fair reasons, but there's also this selectiveness. Plus, the last thing is capacity. Temporary protection is saving a lot of money and also the capacity for the countries of the destination because the proceeding is happening in a group-based recognition. And also it is the reason for many non-EU countries. They don't have a real capacity to proceed all of these demands or legal statuses. Lastly, this is also maybe the one disadvantage of the temporary protection. It is not giving a real right to naturalization or full-scale integration. Often the countries didn't want full integration of the refugees or the full naturalization of the refugees. In generally, yes, it is benefiting the states, but also we should not exaggerate that it is also really helping to the protection of the displaced people in the immediately and have many advantages.
Also, in the first episode of this podcast, we discussed how solidarity is linked to empathy and how, when it comes to structuring our political actions, empathy may not be the most solid ground because it is easier for people to empathize with someone who looks like them. And the closer someone is to you, the more you are able to project onto and recognize yourself in what this person is going through.
Yeah, I agree with this observation. Actually, one of the things I noted about the differentiation between EU's response to Ukrainian and the other crises is this empathy. Because also remember that the first days of the Ukrainian crisis, there's a huge empathy and the solidarity at the very societal and the local level in countries like Poland and the others. It is how the person look like you, but also there is this cultural historical background. You have similarity or kinship, religion, culture, and similar background. Is this creating this more empathic environment? Also, the less threat perception. I should pay attention that Ukrainians are not seen as a threat to the culture of Europe, unlike other refugee groups are seen as a threat to the composition or demography of the Europe. But it is not only specific to the actual Europe. This empathy part we also see in other countries, like for instance Turkey or Lebanon and Jordan. Although Jordan and Lebanon are very small countries, specifically Lebanon, it's only 5 million. When the Syrian influx happened, they received 1 million. 1 million Syrian for a country with a 5 million population. Yes, there were some border issues, but at the same time, there was very close historical and social, cultural kinship relations between these two communities. Similar happened in Turkey, in the border regions, in Jordan. But here, it is called cultural affinity in the literature. I mean, they have a cultural affinity with the country. Okay, the Syrians are also welcomed many refugees from Palestine in the last decades. I mean, there is always this consideration that, okay, if something happened here, we're also going to be displaced and we'll go to the closer place, right? I mean, that type of empathy. But I should add that this empathy is short-lived empathy. It cannot ensure to protect for a long time. It also happened with many Syrian neighboring countries or Afghan neighboring countries. Empathy is for a couple of years and mobilizing the sources. But there is this critical juncture, which I call this in my book about refugee governance. After 3 to sometimes 4 years, there is this critical juncture. If also there is these economic problems or other social problems, the refugees are the first groups who are scapegoated. I mean, this empathy is not always linear upward, but it often goes down and then changing, even turn into the hatred. Because then the countries are saying, oh, okay, they are different. And, the we versus they, even if there is an actual empathy or affinity.
This is exactly what's happening now in countries like Poland or Hungary, where the initial extreme level of solidarity is now turning into a narrative of threat. And politicians often use Ukrainians as scapegoats for any possible problem. And it's really a disturbing thing to observe. But also, probably the reason why I initiated the whole discussion about the protection statuses is to unwrap a bit the imaginaries of solidarity between people coming from different backgrounds. And I'm curious, what are your observations?
First of all, it is state's responsibility to protect people. I will not just call this solidarity, but I think we should bring in this responsibility element, because the states have a responsibility to protect their own citizens, but also other people who are not able to access to the protection. We should not wait for society to show solidarity. It should be more institutionalized. I mean, the Ukrainian crisis showed that, yes, there's a huge capacity of the civil society, huge capacity of the local communities to show solidarity, to show the support, assistance, and also all the other countries, as I said, like Bangladesh, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, their publics showed solidarity. But we shouldn't forget that often there's this resource issue. I mean, the resources are limited. When the resources became more shared and the community go back their own self-centric mechanisms, the lack of the resources or the Limitations in the resources is one factor preventing the solidarity. I also believe that political discourse is preventing the solidarity if there is an anti-migrant, anti-refugee stance very widespread in the politicians' language or in the social media right now, as we observe. This is also preventing solidarity at some point. Also, people and the societies want to see the certainty, including to the refugees themselves. I think this lack of certainty is something preventing the solidarity, because the question is that how long? Okay, how long we are gonna take care of Ukrainians? How long we are gonna take care of Afghans? And this is also the little relevant the fact that often these displacements are protracted. They are not solved in a few years. They are for decades and decades. And Afghans right now is in the 40 years. Syrians did more than 10 years. And Ethiopians, Sudanese, and Venezuela crisis. And all of them is getting protracted and protracted, making the solidarity, difficult to be sustainable. Because of that, there should be an durable solutions. And the last thing, it came to my mind, but I forget. The solidarity is prevented if it is not shared. Shared in a way that, if it's only one community or one state is showing solidarity and the others don't do anything, if not the burden is shared equally and fairly. And this is creating, there is a negative atmosphere that, okay, whether it should be only always Germany should taking the responsibility, or the Turkey with 3 million refugees, and like Lebanon with, the 1 million. That lack of sharing to the burden is also preventing the solidarity in the long run. Maybe I can summarize like that.
But what about the solidarity among displaced communities? So, for example, there was an idea on the beginning of full-scale invasion that such a mass situation of displacement could contribute to positive changes in the EU law. Such scale of displacement can potentially help to other communities who are facing the same. We now know that it didn't happen. You said, and it was very interesting thought, if I understand you right, that the mass migration in 2015 and years after led to the decision to activate temporary protection for Ukrainians, because it was so hard to manage, and sorry for this simple word, but it was such a mass that EU decided that it is easier to enable a temporary protection directive. But still, we see this disproportion in resources that prevents people from, let's say, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, Palestine, to shape solidarity movement that can critically contribute to the perception of the displacement. Am I too idealistic?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. But just one correction. I said that lessons learned from 2015 can have some impact on the, temporary protection activation, but it is not a direct causality. We don't know. It may have some impact along with other things, like probably the other things like geopolitics and the closeness of the Ukrainian and other things are more important. But at least I wish that there is some political learning. We are also discussing in the articles that there are always the same mistakes are done, and then why the organizations didn't learn from their previous mistakes to improve. As we see some improvements in the Ukrainian, I wish there may be some element of political learning and institutional learning from the mistakes done in the 2015. But as I said, I don't have any direct evidence to say that, yes, it is the one of the argumentation, because we were not in these meeting rooms. If we come to your other point, yes, actually there was this optimism that the full-scale invasion and also EU's response that, okay, maybe it will be further institutionalized, this temporary protection, and there will be more empathy. But unfortunately, it wasn't the case, as you said, not only in EU, but also globally. Unfortunately, the current developments in the global scale, and we shouldn't also underestimate the US role and the changes in the governments in many countries, a very strong trend to right and anti-immigration discourse in many countries, also non-EU countries globally. This is also the case in India. Although India, for instance, was very tolerant to the Rohingya refugees for a long time, in the last 2 years, they wanted to deport Rohingyas, although numbers are very small. Because these political discourses are very nationalist and are often built onto the anti-immigration, specifically anti-refugee, and same in South Africa, for instance. South Africa, a number of, the irregular migrants, and so there's a one party, Dudulu movement, like in Turkey. The party established to talk about anti-immigration, like AFT in Germany. Also, the latest votes in Europe show that, yes, this anti-immigration discourse is getting attention of the public, and the public is voting for such parties, not elected them, but still rise in the votes. And countries even like Germany right now restricting its border controls and restricting the rights to the family unification. Same in Sweden, government is restricting and getting more attention to the deportation of those rejected asylum seekers. We have this survey and we see that publics are supporting the deportation of the irregular migrants. And these are making the global regime, the global international order, and the UN is also shrinking due to this US cut of the aid. US cut support to the UN, and there's these questions about what will happen to the UNHCR and the IOM. Unfortunately, the direction is not towards more protection, but towards more restriction when it comes to the refugee or asylum seeking or in migration in general. I'm sorry. I don't want to be, I hope. Yeah, there are still the alternative voices, should I add that? And there is some contestation and very local level solidarity, but we don't see that there is scaling up of these initiatives at a very global level or political level, because politics are a little overwhelming to the humanitarian concerns.
This was the second part of this episode. If it resonated, you know what to do. Our comments and inboxes are open for your thoughts. If you haven't checked the first part yet, it is available at any platform where you get your podcasts. Radio Unheard is supported by the European Union under the House of Europe program, and we are very grateful for this support. Although we also need to mention that its content is the sole responsibility of Radio Unheard and does not necessarily reflect the views of the European Union. This episode was prepared and edited by me, Asia Tsisa. Kafepta created sound design. Most Magazine was there for media support. Communications were coordinated by Victoria Vodyborets. Our webpage, radiounheard.org, was created by Andrew Kay. And by the way, you definitely need to check it.